On this week's episode of Health Made Easy, we have Michael Rubino, an innovative expert in mold contamination and remediation. So when his company does mold remediation, his procedures remove all traces of mold, including the spores that are left behind and end up producing toxins produced by the mold. And one of the things that Michael did that was really great is that he wrote a book called The Mold Medic, where he advises readers on how to choose a mold remediation company and the exact process that the company should be using. His company, All American Restoration, has been featured on USA Today, Reader's Digest, and many other publications. He's also a selected speaker on the Indoor Air Quality Association meeting and expo. So, on to this week's episode with Michael Rubino. Enjoy.
Well, welcome back to Health Made Easy. I'm your host, Dr. Jason Jones, and I'm super pumped because today we're going to be talking about a topic that I have never done on this podcast, and a topic that I think doesn't get the airtime that it absolutely deserves and needs. And I have got Michael Rubino on today, who is going to tell us all about mold sensitivities. And really our topic today is about, are your illnesses and your allergies really mold sensitivities instead? So Michael, welcome to the podcast, man.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So let me ask you this. I know, in the intro, I told folks a little bit about you, but, they may not be aware of who you are, who you represent, what it is that you do. Give us a little backstory before we get into the material.
So I'm a second generation contractor in the restoration space. My dad primarily, he focused on fire restoration. People have fires and there's a devastation and the house needs to be rebuilt. And as you may know, fires are typically put out with water. Fire department comes up, they hook up to their hose to water supply, and they douse out the fire with a lot of water. And if you know anything about mold loves water. It's the catalyst for it to be able to grow. It actually provides the opportunity for the spores, which are part and parcel of the mold ecosystem, to start to grow into more mold. So it's kind of how things work. And, I've been around it since I'm 5 years old, and just being in the restoration space, construction in general. And, it's one of those things where it becomes second nature. And as I started really looking into things, especially, seeing things with the insurance side and how they kind of appropriate funds to make the necessary repairs, I saw time and time again that mold wasn't really something that they were concerned about or something that they really paid attention to. It was really just repair the structure, and throw some bleach on it, paint over it, not that big of a deal. And I think it was after Hurricane or Superstorm Sandy that happened in the Northeast, where I'm originally from. And that's when I really started to see people, sick because of it. And I think that's when I started to really get interested in mold in general. And I could have stuck with the program and become a general contractor. And I decided to completely dive headfirst into mold because I really look at indoor pathogens, and like you said earlier, it's not talked enough about, and it really needs to be.
No, I agree 100% because, I live in what I would consider a swamp. The intercoastal waterway is literally like a mile from where I am. We're at sea level here. We're at 45 minutes from the Outer Banks of North Carolina. So, it is just a wet area. And that was a question I had for you. Is there more common areas where people are going to be exposed to mold? Is it more prevalent in an area like where I live compared to, say, Phoenix, Arizona, where it's dry, or is it something where, anytime there's water, the potential for mold proliferation or exposure is just there?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both. Obviously, being in an area like North Carolina or Florida, where I'm from now, you're going to have this area where a lot of storms hit Humidity can be, awful and unbearable, providing this obviously opportunity for mold to grow. But, when you look at Arizona, I mean, you're still going to have roof leaks. You're still going to have your windows and doors where water intrudes. You're going to have pipe leaks, things like that. The nature of the beast of home ownership, if you will. These things are still going to occur. I mean, from the second that our houses are built, all they do is decay. So you have to constantly, monitor them, maintain them, fix them. And, unfortunately, kind of human nature, we tend to fix things until it's a little too late. And with this, there can be a lot of detriment to that because you're talking about bacteria, toxins, allergens, mold, et cetera, that comes into our house. And you start breathing in those particles at a much higher quantity than you normally would outside. And that's why people typically, say they're not feeling well in their own home, but they feel fine outside.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. In a person's home, when they get, because I mean, as we probably have all seen, by the time you realize you have a leak somewhere and, it's probably been a while, unless it's really, really big, So what are some of the common places that you guys see when you go into a home that are, your biggest culprits? I would think it's like kitchens and bathrooms, and those kinds of things. But, there's pipes running underneath the house, like everywhere,
Yeah. So I would say number one is subgrade spaces, like basements and crawl spaces. And obviously it depends on the age of the home and the style of construction that was used, but crawl spaces have to be hands down like one of the most mystifying spaces because you never go down there. So you never really monitor it. Things happen, water intrudes, you got heavy rains where water intrudes, even if you have open soil, just the moisture intrusion that can occur because the soil is there. The soil is going to get wet when it rains. It's going to transfer, horizontally after it fills up vertically. So looking at that, I would say the crawl space is probably one of those things where I've seen people get sick due to the toxicity of the crawl space and have absolutely no clue because they just never go down there to even look or observe that there could be a problem there. Basements too, because a lot of people have finished basements and they don't apparently know, right, until it's really become a big problem that moisture is intruding off the foundation. And cement's semi-porous. Most basements are going to have a cement foundation. And so you're going to have vapor diffusion that just naturally happens. You're going to have what's called hydrostatic pressure, which is basically as the ground fills up with water, the water has nowhere to go. It starts forcing its way inwards, which is, through your semi-porous concrete substrates. So, that's where these things start to impact the space. And it can be just ever so slightly. And unless you're constantly monitoring the humidity levels in the basement, you may not pick up on it. Sometimes it's not enough water to where it actually is making its way apparent, by having puddles on the floor or showing signs of the drywall being damaged. So these things can just occur naturally over time, ever so slightly, where you don't notice it until it's too late. The other space I would say is attics. We have a lot of attics that are built improperly, meaning they're over-insulated, they block all the ventilation systems that are in place, so they're not allowing that exchange for that hot, humid air to exhaust and escape out. You have renovations where people replace their insulation, but the contractor doesn't remove all of it, and so just puts insulation on top of insulation, again, kind of further creating issues. And you also have, I've seen building busts where they don't have enough ventilation or, and just have no way for this humidity to escape. Your house is supposed to be this system where it exchanges air. You have fresh air coming in and air exhausting out. So usually what happens is it's coming in through the eaves, which are kind of like the ends of the roof structure. So we have that corner here. So your eave is going to be right here. And actually air is designed to come in, go up the structure and push out the ridge. Or, if you don't have a ridge and you have gable vents, it can push out that way. So it really helps create this consistency of air movement. And when one or more of those systems are not taken care of or blocked or not installed properly, it doesn't work as it's intended. So I've seen mold blooms occur in people's attics, especially if you have an HVAC system as well. That can be problematic because all this stuff can get into the HVAC system and now it's circulating around your house. So these are some of the horror stories that you hear about that are unfortunately more common than people would like to admit. And this is where I see, especially spaces that people don't visit or check frequently. And that's when you can really see things start to go downhill.
Yeah, and that makes sense because that's like one of the complaints of the modern home is that they're built too tight. They can't breathe. And it's like we've all heard, but I know you and I have, that the quality of the air in the home is actually worse than the quality of the air outside because they're built so tight.
Yes. Yeah, and I see that a lot, especially now in new construction. They're using, spray foam everywhere. And I guess I love spray foam when you look at its R value, right? You got better R value per square inch than anything else on the marketplace. It also has the ability to air seal, right? So it creates basically another layer on top of the additional layer and seals that layer. And if it's applied properly, there's no penetration of air. But there's a big major flaw with it. Again, kind of going back to that area where I said when the second a house is built, all it does is start to decay, right? Well, think about it like this. Eventually the roof's going to leak, and it happens, right? Especially once out of every 10 years, they estimate that you will have some sort of leak. So as the roof starts to leak, now it's got, kind of nowhere for the water to go. So it's going to run the path of least resistance, which is going to be basically the plane of the wood sheathing. So on top of where the spray foam is applied. So now as water runs down that, it's getting wet perpetually. It's starting to decay the wood. And you really would have no idea because the water's not going to penetrate through that spray foam. It's going to travel down. It's going to cause a lot of damage before you actually realize it. And at that point, I'm sure the mold levels are going to be extremely, extremely toxic because it's just going to be festering there. Yep. And you're not going to know about it. So you're not going to know to repair it. So I think it's with the passive house constructions and all the things that we're moving towards in terms of like net zero energy emissions. I mean, really cool stuff. However, no one's saying now, they're going to say it probably 20 years from now, coulda, shoulda, woulda. But when these houses do decay and things do leak, it's going to be very costly to make those proper repairs. And they're all going to be like, what do we do about this?
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense, and that's the typical. That makes sense. The 20 years, because it's just like once we make a change in science, quote unquote, it doesn't go into the textbooks for at least 20 years. So it just makes sense that would be that way.
And I've had to remediate spray foam projects now, and I can tell you firsthand that what may be $10 a square foot to remediate an area, let's say. It costs sometimes $40 or $50 a square foot when you have to remove the spray foam, because if you've ever had to work with it, it is not easy to remove. So these are the types of things that I think about because I'm like, this is going to be a problem down the road. It's already starting to become a problem now. And, we're having an issue with insurance companies paying for it as it is, let alone adding hurdles to it. So it's definitely going to create some rattles and some ripples throughout the industry, I think, as we start to realize this.
Okay. And are there types of mold that are more common? And you can certainly feel free to add in the ones that are, I would say, maybe more dangerous for health concerns.
Yeah, I would say probably the number one most common mold that I see in people's houses, and this is just anecdotal evidence off of, surveying over 1,000 homes and seeing the common denominator, I would say is Aspergillus penicillium. So Aspergillus and penicillium, they're really different species. There's even breakdowns of subsets of species of Aspergillus and penicillium. As you may know, penicillium, the drug is made from penicillium, the mold. Anyways, those subset of species, when you test for them, they combine them together. They can't differentiate them currently in terms of testing the air. So when those are lumped together, you see that those two types happen to be very prevalent in homes. They're considered allergenic molds, meaning they produce an allergic reaction in folks. However, the misleading statement about that is they are capable of producing what's called a mycotoxin. And a mycotoxin just stands for a toxin produced by fungus. And a mycotoxin, because of the nature of what a toxin is, it is toxic to the body, to animals. And you hear a lot about it more in the agricultural industry than you hear about it in your home, just because it's a fairly new topic in terms of, being worried about it in the home itself, as well as the technology to test for it. It hasn't really been around for hundreds of years or anything. So it's all relatively new in being able to identify and remove and deal with mycotoxins in the home. But that's definitely something to concern yourself with. Then there is Phytosporium and other allergenic species of mold that, I see frequently, not as frequently as Aspergillus penicillium, but definitely in the top tier in terms of allergenic molds. As we get into the toxic molds, which are identified as toxigenic, we talk about Stachybotrys, which a lot of people know. That's what the media calls toxic black mold. And then there's Chaetomium, another toxigenic mold, also happens to typically be black in color, and can also be coined as toxic black mold. So the interesting thing about Stachybotrys and Chaetomium is they're heavier, stickier molds. You don't typically find them in the air. So what you typically have to do is actually swab or test the surfaces that you think they may, be growing on to see if it's there. Because typically it's a short range. It's not in the air very long. It sticks to surfaces. So you have to kind of collect it from the surface to identify it.
Makes sense. That makes sense. And you mentioned mycotoxins earlier, which, I think everybody, has heard of mold. They may even have heard of mold illness, but mycotoxins are probably something that's relatively new for people to not only hear about, but also to understand. But so my understanding with mold, and correct me if I'm wrong here, is that when you go to remediate it, like what you remediate it with, how you actually remediate it, super important, because the mold could certainly, it's going to try to defend itself, by producing its own, you can create, sort of almost like a mycotoxic, effect with the mold, depending on what you try to go in there. Like you said, they just throw in there and try to throw bleach on it, and then paint over top of it. So tell us a little bit about that. Like how, when you go in there to remediate one, what does that look like? What's the difference between, somebody just throwing bleach on it and then how you would actually do it correctly?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And you made actually a very good point. You're right. Basically, mycotoxins are produced by certain species of mold, and it is a self-defense mechanism. We don't know exactly what makes mold feel threatened. And also the word mold is a blanket term used to describe over 100,000 different species of fungus. So, we're very at the infancy stage of really truly understanding everything there is to know about mold. With mycotoxins, for whatever reason, it feels threatened. There's some studies saying that, Wi-Fi or cellular radioactivity could make mold feel threatened. Very interesting studies in that regards, and I'm sure we'll find more over the years as things continue to be studied. But yeah, another thing that obviously would make mold feel threatened is when you try to kill it or remove it. So you have to be careful. What we do in our practice is we assume that mold is producing mycotoxins. We assume that in the removal process, it's going to produce it. That's why when we contain an area, we're very thorough with cleaning the area afterwards, because mycotoxins typically act as like a chemical residue to the environment. So they're going to stick to the surface. And like any other residue, you have to abrasively remove it by, using like a broad spectrum disinfectant and wiping it away. I mean, we use all botanical products. You don't need chemicals. You just need to understand that you got to have some sort of like surfactant in the product to help separate the toxic residue from the surface. And you're going to literally be wiping it away with like a microfiber towel. That's what we do every time. And we don't deviate from that. And that's because we understand that this is part and parcel of the process. What's interesting is there's absolutely no standards that discuss removal of mycotoxins when doing mold remediation. This is something that I happened to stumble upon in 2013. How did I stumble upon it? Well, a mold inspector, a very good one, happened to ask me to remove mycotoxins on a particular project. They tested for it, they identified it was present, and it was my job to kind of just figure it out. And obviously he helped guide me and we did a lot of research together, but it was just kind of one of those things where you're met with a problem, you got to figure out a solution. And that's exactly what we did. And now moving forward and understanding about the way we understand about mold today, it's just got to be part of the process. Cleaning the home and removing the contamination, whether it's the spores or the toxins, has to be a part of the remediation program. Otherwise, you still could feel sick after remediation. I'm sure you've come across some horror stories with that.
Yeah, for sure. Because it makes me, think about, when you could go in and remediate an area, but if they still have, or spores were maybe blown, onto their fabric couch, or their mattresses or whatever that it is, and every time they lay down, they just get exposed again, like the big part has been taken care of, but then there's still that other piece to it. So it kind of leads into my next question, which is when someone starts to have mold illness or like a mold sensitivity, are there common signs and symptoms that a person can have? Because my thought on it is that it doesn't have to smell moldy, for a person to have mold. You don't have to see it, for them I figure by the time that's happening, we're probably in trouble. But what are sort of some of the common signs or symptoms or things where people they go like, man, I think I might have mold. I might want to have somebody check this out.
Yeah, it's actually an amazing question. And, there are so many diagnoses out there that seem to correlate to poor air quality. And a lot of the symptoms that you hear about are so much like every other thing you hear about. And it's going to be allergy-like symptoms. The word allergy by definition just means that any foreign substance entering the body that causes an adverse health reaction is considered an allergy. So you can have an allergy to mold, pollen, dust, etc. Right? And that's just because you're reacting to the amount. Typically, it's an amount. If you had one spore and you breathe in one spore, for instance, you probably wouldn't even notice it. You probably wouldn't even tickle your throat. Now you breathe in 1 million, it's a totally different ballgame. You feel it. You feel the air thick as you're breathing it down. I mean, it's giving you that coughing sensation. A lot of people complain about brain fog and cognitive difficulties, and it's having to lose train of thought. And I've been in the middle of sentences with people, and they completely forgot exactly what they were trying to say, and we had to. So it's okay. You were telling me about this and this, and oh yeah, and it's actually amazing to see, because I've seen it so many times here and there that it's hard to ignore. The other symptoms that you'll hear about, and this is very, very common, is chronic fatigue syndrome, or just the feeling of chronic fatigue, where you're always tired. I mean, I've had people from acute where they're just a little more tired than normal to almost lethargic, where they're, they don't even want to get out of bed in the morning. There's a lot of psychological impacts that people will talk to me about, including deep, dark thoughts, suicidal thoughts, and, this hopelessness. And I think, a lot of that has to do with not feeling well, going from doctor to doctor, not getting proper diagnoses, and kind of feeling like there is no solution, right? The other symptoms you get are, more of like eczema, hives, rashes, skin issues, things like that. And then I would say last but not least, kind of this perpetual, like the onset of a cold that just never goes away. And for me, what I look at it like this is when I talk to people, you get some stuff that you would have never even thought of. And then when you're thinking about it, that makes sense. What I try to tell people is, look, air quality has been something that's really not been on our radar at all. It hasn't even been on our list. And what's interesting to me is you can go a lot longer without food or water than you can without air. And we take 20,000 breaths per day on average. That's a lot of air consumption. And if our air quality is not good, you're going to have a lot of particles coming in, foreign substances entering the body. We don't really know, because we haven't spent the time to study all the effects of these potential, particles that enter the body. So I'd say always, from now on, what we need to do is look at air quality as a holistic piece of our health. And I think if we start doing that, we may accidentally figure out some mysterious illnesses that we have never could have correlated with air quality.
Yeah, and that makes sense because, it's like one of the principles that we teach is synergy. It's just like when you start, a health program of any degree, if you do one thing right, you're going to get this sort of linear result. And when you start stacking the, more right actions up, the more, the better and the quicker you're going to get where you want to go. However, if a person already has multiple health issues, or like what somebody would call a comorbidity, which was a word everybody learned, over this last, 12 to 15 months, and then they get mold exposure, then it can push them over the edge, kind of like overflow their bucket, if you will. So let's say I'm a person who everything is going well, no problems, no allergies, no sensitivities, but I understand that I should probably take some preventative steps in my home. What are some things that you would suggest? Would it be, air purification? Would it be a dehumidifier, in the crawl space? What would you say some things that people could do?
Yeah, it's going to be probably many different things that you can do. If you happen to have humidity that creeps into the 50 to 60% margin or even more, dehumidification needs to be part of your household, because you really want to keep it in between like 40 and 45%. It's kind of that sweet spot. Anything, as soon as you start to get 60% or more, you now have an environment where mold can start to grow. Mold is part of our ecosystem, right? We can't build a bubble around our house. It's going to come into our home. It's what happens when it comes into our home. If it's just becoming part of our dust that gets removed as we clean, that's no problem. If it starts to grow in our homes because there's, we allow for it to do so with, leaks that are unresolved, too much humidity, et cetera, now things start to become a problem. So it's all about controlling the environment and removing the ability for mold to grow. That really makes things easy. The other thing is talking about cleaning. Think about if you leave all this stuff there, right? As mold comes into the environment naturally from outside. If you leave it there by never cleaning your home, and you just get build up, and it's just going to keep coming into the dust and keep accumulating. I mean, now you just have a ticking time bomb, right? The second that the opportunity for it to grow is there, it's going to start growing immediately, because you have these spores, or these seeds, as I like to call them, already abundantly located inside your home. It's just waiting for something to happen. So cleaning is a big important part. That means you're getting something like a HEPA vacuum, not a traditional vacuum, because I think HEPA vacuums should be in every household. They shouldn't even make non-HEPA vacuums anymore, because the technology's there. And the difference between a HEPA and a non-HEPA is a HEPA is going to be able to trap a smaller particle. The smaller the particle you can remove from your home, the better. If it doesn't trap a smaller particle, so using a non-HEPA vacuum, what happens is actually a lot of these particles just get recirculated. So you're sucking it up with the vacuum, it's just spitting right back out at the exhaust, which means it's coming right back into the environment. Something as small as mold, between 2 and 4 micrometers, a non-HEPA vacuum is not going to actually remove it. It's just going to recirculate it back into the environment. Air purification is great. We filter our water, we should filter our air. Having something like an air purifier that hooks up to your central HVAC system is awesome, because it does 2 things. It's removing mold before it gets to the coil. The coil is an environment that constantly condensates, so it's very easy for an HVAC system to get contaminated. This would solve that problem. And also, it's removing these particles and trapping them in the filter before it's getting recirculated. So all those tips and tricks are going to definitely help improve your air quality. And then last but not least, my final recommendation on that front would be hire a professional mold inspector. And definitely when you hire a professional mold inspector, make sure it's not someone that's coming into your house for 10 minutes telling you everything's fine. Just because, we kind of brought this up earlier, it may look fine on the surface. It's what's behind the walls typically that's making us sick. Yeah, not what we don't see on the surface. So when it comes to that, I think we definitely want to make sure that we hire somebody that can look at the home both inside and out, give a good idea as to where they test, and then do any laboratory testing as needed to see and identify if it is a problem, and if it is, how big of a problem really is it? Because now we're talking about building a plan to prioritize our funds to fix it. So we want to make sure that we're doing the right thing in that regard. But a professional may be needed to help diagnose that. Otherwise, you may misdiagnose it, just as if you were to, go to a doctor who wasn't a legit doctor, right? For medical advice. So it's kind of the same thing. And then, with that being said, the whole 15 minutes thing, if you've ever bought a house and you've had a home inspection, it's like a very thorough analysis, usually multiple hours. That's what a mold inspection should look like.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because it kind of reminds me of, my son was struggling in school, and we took him to the eye doctor to get his eyes checked, and they were just like, nope, he's got 20/20 vision, all good. And then somebody said, well, you should go see my doctor, and then we went to this specialist who did an exam that took like 2.5 hours. And it wasn't until he stressed my son for long enough that his 20/20 vision went, when he was under stress, went to 2600, and I think that's kind of a very similar, situation, is that you could have a generalist come in, but then when you have a specialist, it's a whole nother thing, to be able to do, to be able to have a skill set for that. So I'm curious with testing. Again, let's say we had no obvious signs of mold in the home, but it was like, I just think it's a good idea, to get my home tested for what would that look like? Like how does that go?
Well, just like, you have many different tests in the medical field to diagnose different things, you're going to have an array of tests that you can utilize to test the home. There is something called like an EPA 36 or an ERMI, you may have heard of. ERMI is probably the more popular designation. EPA 36 is basically everything that's in the ERMI without the actual score. The ERMI provides a little score, and it's actually my least favorite thing about the ERMI. But what that does, it tests the environments. This is good if you're like renting and you just want a micro shot of what could be going on there. Is there any red flags I need to be worried about? That's really all that's going to do. So if you know somebody that utilizes the technology properly and can actually analyze the species and the amounts present, that could be a good tool to just kind of understand, again, what has happened, what's going on with this building, and is there anything that I should be worried about? There's other tests, which are air tests. Basically, they test the air. And usually what they do is they do an outside control and an inside baseline. And so you look at what's going on the outside at that exact moment, and you look at what's going on the inside at that exact moment. It's not rocket science. If you have a lot more going on inside than outside, you typically know there's something actively growing inside, and you want to figure it out and take care of it. There's also swab tests. The swab tests, basically what they're designed to do is to swab an area that looks like suspect growth. And what you may want to swab is, let's say you see a sign of water damage. It's got the rings. It looks like there was some water there. You can't see if there's really mold growth. At that point, it probably would make a lot of sense to swab that area and just make sure that there is no active mold growth there, that it's just an old leak that dried up quick enough and no mold started to grow. Good. And you would analyze that. So someone who's trained as a professional, they're going to look at the outside, walk around the house, look for signs of weakness where water could have intruded or maybe did intrude. And then they're going to correlate the proper tests to do on the inside. And they should be looking at the HVAC, as the HVAC being a part of the picture too, because of course the HVAC is the lungs of the home. It's constantly circulating air, conditioning it and supplying it back out. You want to make sure that the HVAC looks like it's in good condition and doesn't have any issues as well.
Makes sense. Makes total sense. So, as I know we're kind of getting short on time here, but I want to make sure everybody has, next steps.
Sure.
Because, it's like, our podcast is Health Made Easy. So health isn't always easy, but it doesn't have to be difficult either. It can be simple, if you will. So,
Sure.
so for you guys, this is your baby. This is what you do, day in, day out. Are you guys? Because I know you said you're in Florida now. Now, are you nationwide? Do you guys travel to different places? Do you just do it in Florida? How does that work?
Yeah, our company is actually nationwide at this point. So we're licensed in all the states that require licensing. We're insured nationwide, and we have pretty much hubs set up around the West Coast and the East Coast of the United States, and we travel into the middle of the U.S. as well. So we've done plenty of work in North Carolina, for instance, and we are specialists. So we're not the typical guys that you would call if you had like a small little leak. We're typically guys doing diagnostics. You're pretty sure that indoor pathogens are challenging your health. You're pretty sure that you want to make things right and fix things once and for all. And at that point, we're coming in, we're recommending probably an inspector that we've worked with that we know is good. And we're putting really a team together holistically to improve the environment so that we know for sure it's no longer impacting your health.
Gotcha. So does your company just do the diagnostics? Do you guys do the repair work to the home as well? To what degree do you go to?
Good question. So we only do the remediation work. So we work with really good companies that perform the diagnostics, and that'll actually give us a plan and lab results showing us, okay, where the problems are, how bad is each problem, how do we prioritize a budget to fix these things? And that's kind of what our forte is. And, we're typically working with like local general contractors as well. If we're traveling or if we know of some in the area, we'll recommend some people as well. But we're holistically looking at fixing the problems. And not only that, we want to make sure that as we remove the mold, we're repairing whatever allowed the condition for it to grow in the first place so that mold is a thing of the past.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense. So, well, Michael, let me ask you this sort of last question. So people are listening now, and they want to reach out to your company. They want to check out what you guys have or invite you into their home. What's the best way for them to do that? What's the best way to get a hold of you?
Yeah, so if you like social media, I'm very active on Instagram at the Mold Medic. I haven't mentioned this the entire show yet, but I actually wrote a book called The Mold Medic, hence kind of the name there. And the book really is my research and work that's outlined on how to do this really from a medical perspective, from a science-based perspective, and not just the normal construction industry that mold remediation was usually lumped into. And so if you're interested in learning more about, my work and you want to read the book, go ahead and check out themoldmedic.com. And if you're, pretty sure you want to work with us, go ahead to allamericanrestoration.com, where I have a ton of free resources on how our process works, what our mission is, what our core values are. And you can really, get a feel for wanting to work with us. And that's on allamericanrestoration.com.
Michael, that's perfect, man. Thank you so much. I am so glad we got you on the podcast and that we covered this topic. Like I said, when we got started, I just think that we probably could have gone on for another couple of hours and not even scratch the surface on this thing. But I do think this gave people a really good jump start on understanding this, like what I would consider a huge problem. And the more research and time that goes into it, I think we're going to find that it's a bigger and bigger and bigger problem than we even realize it is now. So, man, thank you for coming on the podcast. Really, really good stuff. And, man, going to have you back on sometime in the future and maybe take a deeper dive on this.
Yeah, let's do that. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me, giving me the platform to share my knowledge and help others in the process. Thank you so much.
That's what we're here to do, man. Thank you very much.